I think we're live. Hello and welcome to Station 11, a presentation. Okay, there was a bump in the road, but I think we're okay. Let's see. Play. Bam. Okay. Station 11, a presentation. Should say by Brian McShane. Forgot to write it. Um, Whoops. This is an outline of the presentation. We're going to do biographical information about the author, a summary of the book. We're going to overview some of the characters. Um, we're going to do two critical approaches, and then I'm going to talk about a paper I'm writing on this book, and then I'm going to stop talking in that order. Um, so this is the author, Emily St. John Mandel. She's the author of four total novels. Station 11 is the most recent. The others are Last Night in Montreal, The Lola Quartet, and The Singer's Gun. She's a staff writer for The Millions, which is a website about books. It's got lists, it's got articles, it's got recommendations. It's actually not a bad site. I went there today to figure out what in God's name it was. She was born in British Columbia, Canada. She lives in New York City with her husband. If this biography seems a little sparse, bear in mind her Wikipedia page is something like 6 pages. Sentences, 6 sentences. Um, so she's either a very private person and has managed to remain that way, or no one is interested, and I find that unlikely given the popularity of the books. Um, Summary of the novel. I wrote that the working thesis of Station 11 is a line from Star Trek, actually, that survival is insufficient. To sum it up in one line, it's a story about a traveling group of Shakespeare actors after civilization as we know it has been ended by something called the Georgia flu, which originated in Russia, so how it ended up being called Georgia. Um, there's an estimate in the book where they say 99.99% of the population is dead, but there's no way to confirm that. Um, Most people are dead. Um, and these actors with the symphony travel on a path, and they go from town to town and they put on plays for people. And the reason I frame my summary as the book having a working thesis is because it's about a higher plane of human existence. The argument that food security, shelter being all a person needs to get by is not true, given the popularity and necessity of not only this Shakespeare troupe and symphony, but the labors of the other people that we'll get into as well. Um, to quote a line from page 38, when asked about why they use Shakespeare plays instead of something either more modern or something more varied, because people want what was best about the world, is the quote. Um, there's potentially a more cogent summary in the forums. To talk about the characters, this is most of what passes as the kind of mystery elements of the novel is the way in which characters relate to each other. I picked three here that I don't think spoil very much, but I don't want to tell you about certain characters because I'd very much like everybody to read this book because it's quite good. Um, Arthur Leander is the actor who, in chapter one of the excerpt on the website, is playing King Lear. He's at the point in the novel that we see him, he's extremely famous. But since the novel goes back and forth and deals with the past, we sort of follow his progression. I think he's kind of a cad. We'll get into why later, but I suspect the way we meet him and the fact that he doesn't outlive the first chapter. Spoiler. Um, Puts him maybe in a more sympathetic light than he otherwise would be if we just knew about him and followed his life. Miranda Carroll is his first wife. They grew up together, Miranda and Arthur. They're like a decade apart. There's a big age difference, but they're from the same very small island in Canada. Um, Miranda is the author of the comic book called Station 11 that the novel takes its name from. Um, and Kirsten is the main character of the traveling troupe of Shakespeare actors. Wait a minute, how are they related? Well, I will tell you that thing. Arthur and Miranda are married. Miranda is Arthur's first wife. Miranda is also the author of Station 11, Doctor 11. These are comics that the overall novel takes its name from. Miranda finishes the books, gives a copy of the first two issues to Arthur. Arthur gives them to a young Kirsten Raymond, who is a child actor in the play in the first chapter. She has these 20 years later when civilization as we know it has fallen apart. So Arthur marries Miranda. Miranda makes a comic book, gives it to Arthur. Arthur gives it to Kirsten, and Kirsten carries these like a talisman, like a good luck charm, like her most prized possession. So that's an example of the way in which these characters are related and why to tell you who specifically the prophet or what happens to some of these characters, who they really are, in my mind, is a bigger spoiler than telling you, say, Arthur doesn't outlive the first chapter, because if you haven't read it yet, you're gonna, and maybe I'll soften that blow for you a little bit. Um, Critical approaches. The first one that I didn't use that actually might be a lot of fun to do would be to focus on employment. It'd be a Marxist paper. Um, if you look at the employment that these characters have before the collapse is the term I should say that the book uses, the collapse of civilization. So when I say pre-collapse, I'm talking about before civilization disappeared. Um, the relationship the three characters here, Arthur, Miranda, and Jeevan, have with work is familiar. Arthur, while he's an actor, and while none of you, I'm not an actor. Maybe none of you are. Maybe you all are. I don't know. Um, it comes at a cost. He'll late in the novel, he has lunch with his oldest and dearest friend Clark, who knew him from when they didn't have $5 to cover the cover charge to go dancing. And this is 20, 30 years later, they sit down together, and his best friend can't tell if Arthur is capable of turning it off or if he's just acting with his best friend. So to explore that relationship, you could say that the nature of acting is such that it infiltrates your entire life. Miranda has a very interesting relationship with work. She starts as a temp with this company called Neptune Logistics. She has, by her count, 45 minutes of actual work to do per day. The rest of it is guarding a desk in case her boss needs her. This is where she gets a lot of her comic book done. She uses her hourly rate job to work on a passion project. So she's kind of giving a big middle finger to the time clock punching aspects of life. Then you have Jeevan, who is in the first chapter. He does, potentially is kind of like a hero. I do ask in the forum, given what I'm about to tell you about him, do you think maybe he's not such a hero? Jeevan's work attitude is he calls work at a point combat. He views it as a means to an end. He doesn't like his work. He went to art school. He started out as a wedding photographer. He got sick of going to weddings and became a paparazzo. Um, I mentioned Arthur and Miranda are married. That's Arthur's first wife. We'll get into that. The night Miranda, on their anniversary at a dinner party, the night Miranda finds out, doesn't find out, it's sort of like Hurston's Sweat, where the woman kind of knows something is up. When she finds out, something's up with Arthur here at this dinner party, the night of their anniversary, Jeevan is outside their house to take a picture, and he gets a picture of Miranda outside, like kind of unkempt looking, and Then later, Jeevan interviews Arthur because at this point he's a legitimate entertainment journalist and he is afraid that Arthur's going to remember him as the person who took the picture of Miranda in sort of disheveled, half dressed, kind of 2 a.m., smoking a cigarette outside. Um, Arthur doesn't remember him, but that's another, I mean, they're related. Now, after the collapse of everything, Jeevan actually kind of makes good. He ends up being the doctor of a small settlement, has a family, sort of cleans himself up, but it takes that for him to go that way. So if you wanted to deal with him, you might say that the the collapse sort of led to him being in a position where he had to get himself together. Um, as for employment after the collapse of everything, weirdly, most people work. There's an airport that's a settlement because planes get grounded and they get stuck there. And the first example of labor there is out of necessity. The people take to hunting. Anybody who knows how to handle a firearm or has any kind of tracking experience is in charge of going out and getting the food. They also take to shoveling the snow off the runway. Because at this point they're still convinced that someone will come and save them, that the Red Cross, the army, someone is coming. Um, and then as they run, they run low on food and things. There's a point where the the budding civilization, as it would come to be, are debating looting one of the airport restaurants, and there's a lot of trepidation. They don't want to do it because they still have their moral compass from civilization. Stealing is wrong, looting is wrong. This is not, what we do. And a gentleman holds up his Amex and he says, I'll pay for it," and he puts it down next to the register. Now there's no power, there's no employees, there's no nothing. But this gesture makes it okay for everybody to then go and eat whatever the restaurant has. It was a Mexican place, I think, so they won't make, tacos and nachos and things. Um, I should say it's an American Mexican restaurant. It wasn't authentic or anything. Um, but this turns into what's known in the book as the Museum of Civilization. Clark, who in his previous life, he's Arthur's oldest and dearest friend. He's a corporate guy. He does what are called 360 reports, where he interviews if there's an executive who's bad at one thing but a good employee, it's cheaper to try to fix the employee than hire somebody new. So his job is basically telling executives what their coworkers said about them while maintaining anonymity. Um, he finds that a child in the airport has a handheld Nintendo system. Tyler, it's actually Arthur's kid. Um, when the batteries die, that gets retired there. An iPhone gets retired there, and it gradually turns into the Museum of Civilization. So this former executive ends up finding a passion project. Diallo as well. Francois Diallo he's a Frenchman on vacation in America when planes stop and he gets stranded. And in the settlement that he works in, he is in charge of the paper. He interviews people that come through. He prints this as best he can. He, classified ads for what passes as the economy, which we'll get to. In his former life, he was in advertising. He wrote copy, which is he wrote, slogans and things for advertisement. And then he came to sort of become the only journalist. And then there's the symphony where the actors and the musical accompaniment. So it might be interesting to look at the way in which even after society ends, there's a necessary relationship between humankind and working, if that makes sense. Um, Now we're going to talk about feminism a little bit. Kirsten, the former child actor turned arguably star of the show. What's interesting about the collapse of civilization is that you could make probably a pretty compelling case that it fixed a lot of things. Um, this breaking into abandoned houses, I'm going to be reading for the next bit, so this is going to be hopefully not too dull. 39 and 40. Quote, when Kirsten and August broke into abandoned houses, this was a hobby of theirs, tolerated by the conductor because they found useful things sometimes. August always gazed longingly at the televisions. When Kirsten was in the houses, she searched for celebrity gossip magazines because once when she was 16 years old, she'd flipped through a magazine on a dust-blackened side table and found her past. She found Arthur. She found um, note of the play that she's in the first chapter. I don't think it would be useful to zone in on sort of, Kirsten, the woman, is obsessed with gossip magazines because she was an actress, and focus maybe more on the fact that she is doing really dangerous work. She is an abandoned house. Is it really abandoned? What are you going to run into? You have no idea. There's note that 20 years out, the the world is not as dangerous as it was, say, in the first 5 years, but anybody could have a gun, anybody could have booby trapped. People live in there, and there's never a note that, oh, Kirsten, you're a woman, you maybe shouldn't do this. There's none of that in the novel after the collapse of civilization. Another thing about Kirsten in these magazines is she does not remember her parents. She cannot picture their faces. Um, she had a brother who she escaped with. Her brother is dead. She assumes her parents did not live past the immediate fallout of everybody getting sick and everybody starting to die and planes being grounded and everything. Um, so I think she identifies more with the stage crew. And when they're trying to contact Arthur's, surviving relatives and people um, to let them know, what happened to him. They talk on page 221 about Kirsten in sort of a passing way. They're talking about the Wrangler, which is I think her name was Tanya. She was in charge of keeping an eye on the child actresses between, I guess between acts and such. Um, and they're talking about Kirsten here and her Wrangler. The Wrangler, quote, this was the girl who did costumes, or actually maybe it was babysitting, something to do with the child actresses, costumes for the child actresses. And I argue here that Kirsten has no recollection of her parents. They likely are dead. Survived a time with her brother. It could be said that her attitude towards gossip magazines and her mode of dress, which we'll get to, uh, was highly impacted by her upbringing among stage crew versus having memories of a family that just aren't there. She cannot picture their faces. Um, at one point, she's interviewed by Diallo, who, as I mentioned, is the newspaper. He's the only, as far as we know, he's the only journalist left on the planet. Um, on page 265, quote, it was evening and Francois had lit a candle in the library. It stood in the middle of a plastic tub for safety. The candlelight softened the scar on Kirsten's left cheekbone. She was wearing a summer dress with a faded pattern of white flowers on red, three sheathed knives in her belt. Um, Kind of a contrast here. You have, a facial scar. She's got a scar. She can't remember where she got it. She's missing a couple teeth. Um, she wears sandals, but she always has a dress on. Now, in a world where you're breaking into abandoned houses, you never know when you're going to have to flee. You never know when you're going to have to fight for your life or anything. I kind of think that's very impractical and attribute that to her upbringing and being a child actress. I mentioned before, I think Arthur is kind of a cad, and here's why. This is a quote from pages 40 and 41. A picture of him with his first wife, Miranda, and then later with his second wife, Elizabeth, a malnourished looking blonde who didn't smile for cameras, then with their son, who was about the same age as Kirsten, and later still with a third wife who looked very similar to the second one. Um, if he isn't an outright cad, he is certainly a stereotype. He is certainly the actor, the philandering actor who trades in marriages for a newer model, to put a sharp point on it. So these would all be interesting, maybe perspectives to handle this along feminist lines. As for possible reasons for all this, there's the total collapse of institutions. There are no churches. There are no organized religions at all that come up, but there is religious zealotry. There is, a town can be taken over by somebody who would equate to a preacher, but has a very tight grip. There's one character in particular, the prophet, who a lot of the actual conflict revolves around. He takes hostages. Um, if you leave his settlement without his permission, he holds a funeral for you because you're dead to the settlement. He gets met very early, and this is sort of a thread that carries through the book. Um, I mentioned economy briefly. There are no states, and I mean states as in nations. There's no America anymore. So there is no this note legal tender for all debts public and private. There is no money. There is no unified currency. So what they do is they barter. There's an ad in the paper for, say, I'm looking for a pair of glasses and I have a pair of jeans to trade. Actually, that's a real example. Um, Oh, I have it here, page 263. There was a reminder that the library was always seeking books and that they paid in wine, and that someone was looking to trade reading glasses for size 6 jeans. Um, which is interesting. That's its own kind of statement because in certain other post-apocalyptic lore, there's a long-running computer game series called Fallout, where the accepted currency is bottle caps. There's a book by a Russian author, Dmitry Glukovsky. It's called Metro 2033, post-apocalyptic, same thing. The accepted currency is pre-apocalyptic military grade ammunition because it has a value and cannot be reproduced in the ragtag settlements living in old subway tunnels. So it's odd that Mandel didn't give them a currency. So I guess you could argue that she's saying that bartering is the best way to go, but that might be kind of a stretch. Now closed. This is for a paper I'm working on for a conference in February. For the apparel off proclaims the man is from Hamlet because Shakespeare actors, it's all fair game. One thing I will note is sourcing a book this new is very difficult. As of this morning, when I went to JSTOR and looked for Mandel, just typed in the author's name, no search results. Typed in Station 11, no search results. Actually, I did find something that said Station 11, but it was talking about a wait station, like a waiter or a waitress in Station 11. So I got real excited for a minute, but it wasn't there. So I have to get creative with my sourcing, but a few of the things I'm looking at, I mentioned the Museum of Civilization in the airport. Uh, there is, I've gone too far. Here we go. There's a quote on page 255. He mentioned it. This is Clark, the curator of the Museum of Civilization. He mentioned it to no one, but when he came back a few hours later, someone had added another iPhone, a pair of 5-inch red stiletto heels, and a snow globe. The argument here that I'm working with is that as they retired technology that they couldn't charge, couldn't use because there's no internet, there's no power, um, the stilettos was, to my mind, very symbolically important. Here's a style of dress and ornamentation that is impractical at the best of times. And now, in a world, like I've said, where you never know where you're going to have to run or go out and shovel snow off a landing strip in case the Red Cross comes, you don't want to be in stilettos. Unless you do. I'm not here to judge you. Um, Another interesting sort of relationship between clothes and the character is Miranda. Miranda is very much a consumerist. She puts a lot of her self-worth in her outfit, and as her professional life changes, her outfits change, and she uses clothing to compensate for feelings of inadequacy. Um, to highlight that, page 80, this is very early. This is when she just starts working at this Neptune Logistics, and she is, not very well off. There's another girl in the office, Thea, and it quote, in Thea's presence, Miranda feels ragged and unkempt, curls sticking up in all directions, while Thea's hair is glossy and precise. Her clothes never quite right, whereas Thea's clothes are perfect. Miranda's lipstick is always too gaudy or too dark, her heels too high or too low. Her stockings all have holes in the feet and have to be worn strategically with specific pairs of shoes. The shoes have scuffed heels filled in carefully with permanent marker. The clothes are a problem. End quote. Um, this is how we are introduced to Miranda's relationship with outfits. She feels like less than because of what she's wearing. She's always holding herself up to other people. I mentioned she marries Arthur. They get married. They're in a restaurant and she's trying to put a coat on in such a way that the hostess won't see that the lining inside is all torn. Um, but she does climb the scale. After Miranda and Arthur get divorced. This is on page 107. Quote, in 4 months, Miranda will be back in Toronto, divorced at 27, working on a commerce degree, spending her alimony on expensive clothing and consultations with stylists, because she's come to understand that clothes are armor, rising rapidly through the company until she comes to a point after 4 or 5 years when she travels almost constantly between a dozen countries and lives mostly out of a carry-on suitcase, and puts on the clothes that make her invincible. This marks, in my mind, a real change in the character. Now, remember, this is the one drawing comic books with a real passion project, kind of lets her use of clothing covering her inadequacy, her perceived inadequacies, kind of run amok. Um, there's also a character named Saeed, who's one of the post-apocalyptic actors, and Arthur, we spoke about. Arthur Leander, the actor from Before the End of Everything. This is to highlight sort of there's a bit in Henry V. I don't know if you've ever read it. This is sort of how I'm proving this, where we're talking about divine right of kings and this, God ordained monarch. At a point in the play, he puts on a cloak, just a simple cloak, and he's able to move among the soldiers, and no one has any idea who he is, which to me says that the God ordained monarch can mute his own perceived, splendor with clothes. There's a bit of that working in both directions with Saeed and with Arthur. Um, for Saeed, this is on page 44. Saeed carried himself with a regality that Kirsten had fallen in love with once. Here in this parking lot in a pressing heat wave, patches of sweat under the arms of his t-shirt, knee-torn jeans, he was perfectly credible as a king. And then Arthur, who plays King Lear, who is a famous actor, very much sort of the modern take on royalty. This is on page 71, quote, earlier in the day he was wearing a crown, but now he's wearing a Toronto Blue Jays cap that makes him look very ordinary. This to me is the, two sides of the same coin. This is a dirty post-apocalyptic ripped jeans actor who doesn't have the costume for it, but all of the can embody all of the power of a king without the adornment. And then you have Arthur, who is, as I said, kind of our modern day royalty, who can subdue his presence like Henry V did with the cloak by just putting on a cap. And then Kirsten we'll go back to for a minute here. This is on page 151. This deals with costumes specifically. A few of the actors thought Shakespeare would be more relatable if they dressed in the same patched and faded clothing their audience wore, but Kirsten thought it meant something to see Titania in a gown, Hamlet in a shirt and tie. The tuba agreed with her. The tuba is the tuba player. Some of the characters go by their instrument names, but this goes in with an article I have here from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Clothes and the Historian. The detailed study of costumes should therefore help to make history more vivid by showing what clothes historical characters actually wore. Sort of the correlation I'm trying to make here is Kirsten thinks it's very important that the characters who play royalty and play, high class. Hamlet was a prince. Titania was in Midsummer Night's Dream. She's like queen. Should dress the part, um, if not to if not to impress the audience, to show there was a time where such distinction still existed. Um, to go back to Kirsten's individual attitude, page 297. There was a place where ivy had spread from the forest and covered acres of highway in green. They waded through it, the leaves soft on Kirsten's sandaled feet. Um, this to me is a way to stay connected to nature, with miles of freeway, cracked freeway, and rotting cars. Anytime there's real nature, they're always going to be moving through it because they're constantly on the road. I think I would argue that Kirsten's wearing sandals to sort of passively remain in contact with nature. Um, yeah, that's all I got. Thank you for your time, and I pray that this was at least slightly audible. I've had issue with the audio, but here we go. We're going to stop now. Thank you for your time. Bye.